It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'll be walking you through the first part of our show today. As always, we're going to start with a little bit of a recap of last night and what went on there. We'll move on, talk about some of the weather concerns we have for today. We'll go on, mention some of the Vegas lines, some of the important stuff we saw over there. We'll move on to pitching. I'll bring in Josh, my co-host and our pitching guru, so that he can go over some of the things he sees. He was on some of the right guys last night, so hopefully we can keep that going again today. And then we're going to go on to hitters. But before we get into hitters, I'm going to do a little bit of a teaching point today for you guys on some of the under-the-radar players that we've been noticing. A couple guys who tend to go lower owned and basically have been producing day after day for us. So these are some of the guys we think you should have on your radar. Definitely for GPPs if you're looking for some low-owned options. And a lot of these guys, the way they've been playing, even make a lot of sense for you in your cash games today as well. After that, Josh and I will talk about some of the hitters, give you our cornerstones for today, and hopefully we can go on and we could all make some money. So let's get into it. Let's start with our recap from last night. Last night was a pretty interesting night. It was a very high-scoring day over on DraftKings. DraftKings had their $300,000 Slugfest tournament. 218 was the top score. Over on FanDuel last night, we saw scores creeping up into the 70s. Some even made it into the low 80s. Had a couple really good pitching performances. Had a couple of the big bats that went on and had a couple home runs. And these were some of the guys who were higher owned. So it wasn't like a situation where one or two people had them. There were a lot of people that had a couple of these guys that had some big 2-for-3 with a home run games and a couple RBIs. It was some of the more highly used players that, were some of the ones who went off last night. So let's take a look at some of them. Chris Sale bounced back pretty good last night. Him and Jake Arrieta each put up 37 DraftKings points. So they were two of the better starts on the day. The best start on the day actually was also the best value, low-owned. 4,800 he was over on DraftKings. I think he was in the $5,000 range over on FanDuel. Chris Heston from San Francisco went out against Houston, had a complete game, gave up 2 hits, 1 run, had 10 strikeouts. I think he finished with 43 DraftKings points, so that was a monstrous return if you paid for him. He was only 4,800, so he basically got you 9 points per $1,000 of cost. And, when you got a guy like that who can get you 48 points, it's easy to see how scores could add up and get you up into the 200, 218 range as some of the winners had yesterday over on DraftKings. So those were some of the pitchers that you needed if you really wanted to get it done. A lot of the guys that we were on yesterday did all right as well. Arrieta was a guy that we mentioned for you. As I said, he had a huge day. Burnett was another guy we were on. He finished with about 3 points per $1,000 worth of cost. So he was a great cash game option, even helped you in your GPPs. And Alfredo Simon, however you say that, he went off yesterday. $5,000, basically a min-price guy, and he returned over 20 DraftKings points for you. Had a nice return on FanDuel if you used him over there too. He was more expensive on FanDuel, so it made a lot more sense on DraftKings. But as an SP2 on DraftKings, $5,000 to get the kind of performance that he gave you, that was definitely a good night for you over there. So that's some of the pitching. Some of the batters that went on, the late game was basically where we got a lot of the value. So if you stacked up a lot of bats in those early games and you were on top of the GPPs early, there's a good chance you got caught from behind. And if you were one of those people who basically left some spots for some of those late game guys, you probably had a pretty good march up into the standings of whatever you were in yesterday, whether it be a 50-50 or some of these tournaments around the industry. We had the Dodgers stack was the one that helped take down some of the big tourneys on DraftKings last night. Some of those same guys were over there on FanDuel helping out as well. Dodgers pounded out 11 runs. Everybody kind of had a little piece of it. Everybody had a couple RBIs. Everybody had a couple hits. They had about 4 or 5 guys on their team who had double-digit point totals on DraftKings. So whenever that happens, you tend to see those bats on that big scoring team on the top of some of these tournaments that we see over on DraftKings. So the Dodgers were definitely a good one to have. A lot of the guys we gave you yesterday had good days. Stephen Vogt hit a home run. Josh Reddick at 3,700. I mean, I know Josh, my partner Josh, wrote him up as our value play for the day. 3,700 on DraftKings. The way that guy's been playing, that was just a steal and a perfect matchup for him. So he went yard. He had a couple hits, picked up a couple RBIs. Finished with about 25 DraftKings points, I think. Double-digit points over on FanDuel as well. Had a big day for you. Just about 10 points, I think, on aces. So having Reddick in your lineup was definitely something that you needed last night. Let's see who else did well. Bryce Harper kept his hot streak going. Whenever you get him in a matchup with a right-handed pitcher, he's a guy you got to watch, especially now. I mean, he's been red hot. He's got about 7 home runs in the last week or something like that. So absolutely on fire. He's a guy you got to consider. Mike Moustakas, he hit a home run last night, late home run in the 7th inning. There was actually a stretch there where Stanton, Moustakas, and Stephen Vogt all hit home runs within about 3 minutes of each other on the clock. So there were a lot of people that were sitting at 40 and 50 in some of these, some of these 50-50s, some of these tournaments that were thinking they were going to have a bad night, and then all of a sudden got about 50 points in a matter of 3 minutes before anything even updated and tracked on the DraftKings site. So those were some of the big bats that you needed. We had a few misses yesterday too. We weren't on everything. Tulo, I don't know what's wrong with him. I watched a couple of those at bats yesterday. The one that he struck out on the high pitch yesterday, the high fastball, I mean, he's usually a guy who has a lot more plate discipline than that. I don't know if it's just that he really doesn't want to be in Colorado anymore. We all know he asked for a trade yesterday that he basically wants out of town. But, I mean, it almost looks like his head's not in the game. I don't think it's anything physical. I don't think he's hurt, which is usually the concern with Tulo is, oh, my God, did he do an ankle? Did he do a shoulder? Did he pull his back out? He looked fine physically, but I feel like mentally his head isn't in the game where he is right now. So hopefully they get that situation worked out pretty soon because he's one of the few shortstops left that actually has some upside and, is a guy that you wouldn't mind having in your roster when he's right. But right now, I just don't think he's right. I know I recommended him yesterday, which is why I watched those at-bats, and I was not impressed. And he's usually a guy who I'm very impressed with. So that's just my little thought on Tulo, my little rant there. I just had to get that out. Adam Jones had a bad day yesterday. Mike Trout had a bad day yesterday. Those were some of the other guys that we mentioned. But if you had the other guys, if you had the Vogt, if you had Moustakas, if you had Reddick, you had Harper in your lineup, I had a lineup with all those guys in it together, and, the guys that did well did wind up carrying me and putting me over that cash line. So yesterday was a pretty good day. That kind of sums it up for last night's slate. Some solid pitching we had. Arrieta, Burnett, Simon, all those guys were good. If you had Sale was good. You had Heston was good. Even Archer wound up, with a rocky start, still wound up finishing with 23, 24 points. So pitching, you could have went a lot of ways yesterday. It was, a lot of ways to go. So let's move on and start talking about today. There's a couple weather concerns today. The big one is that Texas and Kansas City Royals game. It's about a 98% chance of rain right now. It kind of looks like it's going to be a sustained rain, meaning that they might not have a window to play this game. Definitely looks like it's going to be delayed at the Open if everything stays, the way the radars are showing it right now. And there's a very good chance that game might get canceled. So if you were thinking about using any of those Texas bats, I know there was a couple who I was thinking about using against Ventura, who's been struggling lately. Just put those ideas on the shelf for now because it looks like that game's not going to go off. We have 2 games with wind blowing out. Both of them in LA. The Dodgers are home, and so are the Angels. The Dodgers have Miami. The Angels have Colorado. The wind's blowing 9 miles an hour out of both of those stadiums today. Not anything huge. Neither one of them's a big home run hitter park, so it might help a little bit, but it's not something that's really going to, make me want to target it. But there is a wind situation that I do want to target. As we know, when the wind is blowing out in Wrigley Field, the home runs tend to fly out of there. That ballpark doesn't have much cover, so the wind is definitely a big factor. Well, it kind of works the same way when the wind is blowing in. And today the wind is blowing in. Matt Harvey is going to be starting against that Chicago Cubs team with the wind blowing in, meaning the balls are going to be staying in the ballpark, And with the wind at the pitcher's back, it actually makes those pitches that they're throwing come in, like we said yesterday, when it's in his face, it's a mile an hour or two slower. When it's at his back, it's going to be a mile an hour or two faster. And, with the fastball that Harvey has, the reaction time that the hitters have to hit it, a mile an hour or two could be, a significant increase for them. So I'm expecting a great game out of Harvey today. We'll get into him a little bit when we, when we start talking about pitching, because I know he's definitely one of the guys that I have high up on my list. We're going to move on and start talking about the Vegas lines today. We're going to try to shorten it a little bit so we can talk a little more in depth about some of the players. But there's a couple things that I found interesting that I wanted to point out to everybody. The first one is Liriano and Hamels. That Pittsburgh Pirate and Philadelphia Phillies game has the lowest over-under on the day. The over-under on that one is only a -7. So -7 is basically I think that's the only game today that's at -7 as I'm looking at it right now. So that is one that you got to expect. The pitcher's duel coming. Two very good left-handers going up there. The offense for the Pirates has been a little better. The offense for the Phillies actually hits left-handed pitching pretty well, which, again, I'm going to get into when I talk about some of my starting pitching, why basically why I'm not a huge fan of Francisco Liriano today, although I hear his name, kind of being mentioned all over by a lot of smart people who I trust in the industry. Other things that were interesting about the Vegas lines, we had the Detroit-Minnesota game is the one with the highest line total, the highest run total today. They're expecting 9 runs in that one. They're expecting runs on both sides, actually. We got Kyle Gibson going up. It's Gibson against Lobstein in that one. So those are two guys who could get hit. Gibson going up against that Detroit offense. That's one of the best in the league. And Lobstein, who hasn't been very good at all, going up against Minnesota. Some of those right-handed Minnesota bats are going to definitely be in play. Guys like Dozier. Kenneth Vargas is going to be batting higher up in the order today, so he's definitely a guy I think we should consider as well. There's definitely going to be some runs scored there, so you might want to look there to get a couple bats into your lineup, especially if you're playing in cash games today. And then the last thing that kind of stood out to me is Carlos Frias from the Los Angeles Dodgers is a -160 favorite today. And it's not that I didn't think he was going to be favored today, but -160 makes him one of the biggest favorites on the day. So that was something that was a little surprising to me. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and it's going to move us right on into our pitching for today, Matt Harvey is only a -115 favorite today. Now, he's the most expensive pitcher on all the sites today. He has a matchup that you would think would be good. Basically, he started out as about a -160 favorite. He's down to -150 right now. So he's not the biggest favorite on the day. A guy like Frias is actually a bigger favorite than he is. And the thing about Harvey, basically I think everybody's going to be using this guy tonight because everybody knows at this point that the Cubs struggle against right-handed pitching. They have the highest K rate in the league against right-handed pitching. And a guy like Harvey is, basically a big strikeout pitcher. So if you get a guy who's already a strikeout pitcher and put him up against a team who strikes out the most in the league, it should lead to a high strikeout game for him. Now, the strikeouts, as we know in fantasy, are what creates that floor that we really want. So if we can get a high strikeout game from our pitcher and pretty much almost guarantee it, that's going to be a good situation that we're going to try to exploit. So I think you're going to see an absolute ton of Harvey tonight if you're playing in head-to-heads, if you're playing in 50-50s, if you're playing on a one-pitcher site like FanDuel, I think he's going to be the most popular guy that people are going to roll out. If you're playing on a two-pitcher site, like a Fantasy Aces or a DraftKings, I think he's going to be one of the two pitchers that everybody has a bunch of. So I think that you're definitely going to need some exposure to this guy because if you don't have any exposure to him, you're going to be behind the 8-ball, especially because it's a good matchup for him, and he should be able to rack up some strikeouts. So if he can limit the home runs and keep them off the board, keep them to maybe 2 or 3 runs, I could definitely see like a 7-inning pitch, 10 strikeout, 2 or 3 run, 5-hit performance coming out of Harvey tonight, and that would give you a pretty good return over on FanDuel. Might put you a little below where you need on DraftKings. You really need to get about, I'm going to say you're going to need a minimum of about 28 to 32 fantasy points out of him on DraftKings tonight, which is a pretty tall order. I mean, if you look at it, it's not going to be easy for him to get there. And again, remember, they are kind of limiting this guy a little bit, so I don't think there's a big chance for a complete game bonus out of him. But with that being said, he is my favorite pitcher on the slate tonight. We're going to get in and start talking about pitching now. Harvey is my number one. It's a -165 favorite. He goes up against that Cubs team that has a K rate of over 25% against right-handed pitching. And, I mean, Harvey's been great so far to start the season. You know, he struggled a little bit in his last outing, but he's 5-1 right now with a 2.72 ERA and a whip of 0.96. Now, again, the Cubs bought up all those young bats. They got a lot of bats in that lineup now that could hit. You know, a guy like a Chris Bryant is a pretty good hitter. You know, a guy like Addison Russell, you know, they brought those guys up, made their lineup longer, it lengthened that lineup out for him. You know, put a lot of right-handed bats in that lineup, though, which is the drawback to it. The only three lefties they really have at this point are Rizzo, Montero, and Chris Coughlin, who, with the bat, is not bad, but he's been atrocious in the outfield for them. So I don't know if it really helps or hurts them when he's in there playing against right-handed pitching. But basically, at this point, I mean, Harvey's the biggest stud. He's a little bit over $10,000 on DraftKings. I think he's a little over $10,000 as well on FanDuel. So he's definitely not cheap tonight. He's going to be somebody that you're going to have to pay up for. But if you're looking for probably the safest return, I mean, you're talking about one of the highest one of the highest strikeout pitchers in the National League right now, going up against the team with the most strikeouts in the league. So you can expect a high strikeout game. You know, Harvey's a guy who tends to pitch deep in the games. He gets into the 7th, gets into the 8th inning. Rarely does he ever, not get there. Even though he's on a pitch count, he's so efficient that he still winds up getting through at least 6 in basically every one of his starts this year. He's been able to get into the 8th inning by throwing less than 100 pitches on more than one occasion so far. So, like I said, he's going to have a lot of ways that he can score. And again, I mean, the guy's been so good. He hasn't given up a lot of runs. Doesn't give up a lot of hits, doesn't walk a lot of batters, so there's not going to be a lot of those negative events that you really got to worry about with Harvey. So Harvey's my number one. He's definitely the guy at the top of the list. I thought pitching after Harvey, though, gets kind of tough. So if you're playing on FanDuel today, I definitely think he's the guy you can plug in. But if you're playing over on DraftKings, this is where it gets a little hairy. There's a couple guys that I'm actually interested in hearing Josh's take on, because as of right now, the guy who I have listed as my number 2 favorite start on DraftKings is actually Carlos Frias from the Los Angeles Dodgers. He has 2 starts so far, 17 and 19 DraftKings points. So not a great upside to him, but a pretty nice return. His price is only $5,100, so he's given you really good value at 17 and 19 if his price is only $5,100. That's basically a return of more than 3, almost 4 points per $1,000 of cost, which, again, if you were going to get that out of a guy like Harvey, you would need Harvey to get you over 42 DraftKings points, basically, which would mean he would need to go, something along the lines of a complete game or a complete game shutout, or go like 8 innings with like 13, 14 strikeouts, something like that, and limit a lot of the damage. So in order to get that kind of a return, I definitely think that Frias could be in play. If you're going to go down, like a guy last night, like we recommended Simon, who was 5,000. If you're going to take one of these guys who's 5,000, 5,100, what you really need to make sure of is that they're going to get you at least 20 DraftKings points. If you can't get 20 DraftKings points out of these guys, then, it's probably not worth it for you to go down there and get them. But I think Frias could give you that kind of a return tonight. He's averaging a little over 5 innings per time that he goes out there. He usually goes somewhere between 5 and 6. And remember, they're going to start letting him pitch a little deeper into it. The beginning of the season, he was a reliever. So the first 2 starts that he had this year, they only really let him go about 5 innings because they're still stretching him out. They're still getting him used to going that longer distance. So right now, the fact that he's only pitching 5, maybe 6 innings, and he's doing it with, basically 4 or 5 Ks each time out there, that's going to give him about an upside of 21, 22 DraftKings points, for you to deal with. So if he can limit the runs, which is what they're expecting today, he plays against Miami today. Miami is a high strikeout team, although they do hit the ball pretty well and they do score a couple runs. If he can limit them to under 2 or 3 runs, that's going to give him at least 15 or 16 DraftKings points. And obviously, as a big, as a big minus 160 favorite today, it also puts him in line to get the win. So if he can get 15 or 16 DraftKings points and pick up the win, that puts him, right about 20, which is where we would need him to be in order to make him a good start at, 5,100 today. Now, before I bring on, I'm going to bring on my partner, Josh Kalachi, in a second to go over some of his pitching options. He's our pitching guru over here, so I'm anxiously awaiting what he wants to say. But before I do that, I'm going to make one quick case against a guy who I know a lot of people are going to be using tonight, and I am going to be fading. I'm not going to be playing bats against this guy, but I just don't think he's somebody who I'm going to be starting, and that's Francisco Liriano. Now, if you guys remember, I recommended Liriano last week or 2 weeks ago. He's actually a guy who I do like. I like the way he pitches. I like, what he brings you with the strikeouts. I like what he brings you with limiting runs and hits and everything along those lines. But there's a couple things today that make me a little nervous about using him. For starters, he has a negative park switch. So he's going from pitching in a place in Pittsburgh that's a good pitcher's park, place where he usually winds up pitching well, into Citizens Bank Park in Philly, which is much more friendly to hitters, basically. And by being a hitter's park, that's obviously going to be a switch for him. So I definitely think that's one thing that gives him a little bit of a tick down today. Second thing that I think gives him a tick down is, despite the fact that the Phillies aren't doing all that great this year, one thing they are doing very well in is hitting against left-handed pitching. Right now, they have the 7th highest team batting average in the league against left-handed pitching at 275. So it's not like he's going to have an easy time mowing through this lineup. I don't know why that is, because they do have a lot of lefties in there. I guess they've been throwing a lot of their right-handed bats when they face some of these left-handed pitchers. But 275 batting average is, pretty high. That is one of the better ones in the league. Like I said, they're 7th against left-handed pitching right now. And that was something that was surprising me when I was looking at the numbers, because you wouldn't have thought, the Phillies, who are, most would agree are kind of struggling this year, would be one of the teams that you would really want to have fear against, if you were a left-handed pitcher. But so far this year, that seems to be the case. The other thing they do really well, they have a very low strikeout rate against left-handed pitching. Right now, it's only 18.4%. Now, we usually like to see numbers up around like 23, 25%, somewhere in that range is what we want to target. If you have a team that's only striking out about 18, 19% of the time against left-handed pitching, that's very, very low. So for a guy like Liriano, who needs those strikeouts in order to help his score, if he's not going to get the strikeouts and he's going to be giving up a lot of hits against a team that has a pretty high batting average against lefties, neither one of those things tell me that he's going to be one of the highest scoring guys on the day. Again, we talked about the park switch already, and the last thing is he's not really a certainty for the win. He's going up against Cole Hamels. Hamels is a very good pitcher. He's a guy who I know Josh likes today. I think he's going to mention him. Rath mentioned him this morning. He's a guy that's been popping up on a lot of the screens that we run. We'll run screeners where we look for, the things that we want. Guys who shouldn't give up a lot of runs, guys who should be able to get some strikeouts today, guys who should be able to limit walks and hits from their opponent based on, splits, matchup, handedness, stuff like that. And, Hamels' name is one of the ones that keeps popping up. So I know a lot of people are talking Liriano. I know a lot of people think Liriano is going to be a good start today. But for me, the two guys I'm going to be putting in a lot of my lineups are going to be Harvey and Frias. And the one guy who I'm going to be avoiding on the starting pitcher side, although not targeting against, he's in that middle group where I'm not using him, but I'm not trying to go against him. And that's going to be Francisco Liriano. But I'm going to kick it over now to our pitching guru, Josh Kalachi. I'm interested in hearing what he has to say about some of these guys, because he's basically the guy who I follow when I need pitching advice. So, Josh, what do you got for us today?
Real quick, I want to talk about Carlos Frias first. You just mentioned him. He's going to be in a lot of your lineups, and I'm going to use him as a tournament option myself. And just get this. He's been fantastic this year. I know he hasn't pitched very much, hasn't gone deep into games, but if you look at what he's done so far, it's really remarkable. I look at ground ball rate a lot for sinker ballers and guys that have a lot of hard stuff, and that's a guy like Frias. And he has a ground ball rate of like 62%, I believe, this year, which is just incredible. We look at guys that with high ground ball rates, and you're talking 50, 51, 52. He's 10% higher than that. And for those of you familiar with the game of baseball, the more ground balls there are, the more likely it is for a pitcher to get an out. Another reason why I like him is because, and I think this is one of the main reasons why he doesn't pitch more than 5 or 6 innings, he uses 2 pitches. He has 95% fastball or cutter. He throws 95 miles an hour with a fastball. It has a little bit of run on it as a two-seamer going into righties and away from lefties. But the other pitch he uses is a cutter, which is also in the low to mid-90s. And what this does is it creates the opposite movement as a two-seamer does, and that's a lot of what Frias does with his primary pitch. But with his ability to throw this two-seamer, four-seamer, and a cutter, all fastballs, all hard, it's hard for a guy to get around on the ball. And although he doesn't have a changeup or a curveball that he uses much, he throws it every now and then, but it's just about maybe 3 or 4 times a game, so it's not something we like to target. His stuff is so good and so quick with a lot of movement that he's able to get guys out. Now, that being said, you guys have heard me talk a lot about different guys that can just to get guys out through the first or second time through the order. But the fact remains, if he has just 2 pitches, that third time through the order, he could be in trouble, and that's why he's just a tournament option for me. But as Benny said, he's talked about Cole Hamels, Matt Harvey, guys like that. And those 2 are the 2 top pitchers for me today. And today I think is the day you should spend on pitching because other than the top few, there's not many guys to target that are very safe with limited risk. First guy I want to talk about is Cole Hamels against the Pirates. We always talk about targeting the Pirates when they face a left-handed pitcher for many reasons. They strike out the most in baseball, close to 30% against left-handed starters. They're hitting just 204. The slugging percentage is around 350, 360, which means they're not hitting the ball often, and they're not hitting the ball hard or into the gaps even when they do. One thing that I'd like to talk about, and you guys have heard me discuss this before, is a changeup. When a left-handed pitcher has a changeup, it's great against right-handed hitters, and when a right-handed pitcher has a changeup, great against left-handed hitters. I want to talk about that for a little bit because the Pirates lineup is stacked with right-handed hitters. We're talking about guys like Jung-Ho Kang, who's been one of the better hitters recently. Obviously, Andrew McCutchen's a big right-handed bat. And against lefties, they try to use Corey Hart as well. And if he's a cheap option today, a lot of people will be targeting him. But you got to remember, Cole Hamels' changeup is one of the best pitchers in baseball. If you haven't seen him throw in the last couple of years, it's a treat to watch him throw this changeup to left-handed batters. His fastball is about 91 to 92. His velocity's decreased a little bit in the last couple of years, but he can still crank it up there when he needs to. But this changeup just dives out of the strike zone and moves away from right-handed hitters, and it's his strikeout pitch. It's the reason why he hasn't had to work on a slider or a cutter, which he throws a little bit now, or a curveball, because his changeup's been so good in Philadelphia for the last 10 years. One reason why I'm targeting him is because he can strike out a lot of hitters, and with that right-handed Pirates order, I'm definitely targeting a guy with a changeup as good as Hamels. The next guy is, I know you guys knew this name was coming, it's Matt Harvey. It's Harvey Day. Everybody likes to bring that up. He's one of the best pitchers in baseball. He's probably the top 3 right-handed pitcher now, considering the fact that he's been stretched out a little bit. They're not going to let him throw 120 pitches anymore. But the truth be told, he doesn't need that many pitches anymore. The Cubs is who he's facing today. They strike out the most in the league against righties, which it's a great matchup because they strike out a lot. Harvey's a strikeout pitcher with 4+ pitches. He can get that fastball in the high 90s. You've seen him throw his slider. You've seen him throw his curveball. He has 3 or 4 pitches that he can use at any time. Now, he doesn't have to because his fastball is so good. So he throws that fastball over 50% of the time. If he throws 100 pitches, he's going to be throwing that fastball 55, 60 times. And if a hitter can't hit a fastball, there's no reason to go to your secondary pitches, and that's one of the reasons why Harvey's been so good. He throws downhill. We just talked about his other pitches, and yesterday, if you guys got a chance to watch Syndergaard, I know I was happy to see him throw. You saw him throwing straight down. It's hard for a hitter to get around on that because not only are they hitting the ball square or right on the nose, they have to worry about getting on top of it. And being able to hit the top half of a ball that's coming down at you, it's definitely a tough thing to do. So Harvey doesn't have a tough matchup because the Cubs strike out a lot. So even if he gives up a few runs, those strikeouts should definitely balance out the negatives that allowed for hits or for earned runs. The third guy I want to talk about is James Shields. He didn't originally pop up on my research this morning, but I kind of gave a little bit of leeway on either side because he was just under the threshold. That's something I do like to look at because if a guy, like there's some other good pitchers that didn't reach the thresholds, or some bad pitchers that reach the threshold, rather, and you don't want to get those guys because they're not great pitchers. But if a guy's close to your research and close for what you're looking for, but is a good pitcher, you have to give him a chance, and that's exactly what I'm doing with the James Shields against the Mariners. He pitches in Safeco today, I believe, which is a huge park. There's not a lot of home runs hit there at all. There's a lot of room for those fly balls to be caught. Although the Mariners do have Nelson Cruz and Robbie Cano, who really has not hit the ball well, not many other guys in that lineup can hit, and that's one reason why I'm targeting Shields because he is a big strikeout guy, and the Padres are hitting just 239 against righties, or the Mariners are hitting just 239 against righties. Shields is not my 1 or 2, as I do like Hamels and Harvey, but if you want to save a little bit of money, he's that third guy I'd be using. There's another guy that could be pitching simply based on the rain, and what Benny talked about earlier is that's Yordano Ventura. I like him a lot today against the Rangers. Of course, we got burned a little bit with Volquez against the Rangers last night, but apparently that blister problem still hasn't been fixed, and that's a big thing for a pitcher. Giordano, if he pitches, is a very good option because the Rangers still struggle against righty. They're hitting just 220. I think they're slugging just over 300, which is a really bad number for a team with a lot of big bats like Fielder and Chu, guys that they're paying for, especially like Beltre. The only thing with Ventura is he's another guy that gets hit a little bit that third time through the order because he just uses 3 pitches and only uses 2 really efficiently. He has a fastball, 2-seamer, and a 4-seamer that he throws all the time. And if he's letting that ball up over the plate, that can get him in trouble, especially against those left-handed hitters. So I'm not targeting him in my 50-50 or head-to-heads today simply because he can get lit up that third time through the order. But he's a decent option with strikeout upside in tournaments. Now, the one other guy I want to talk about, and holding my breath a little bit here because he's not that great of a pitcher, but he has that good matchup. And Jordan Lyles, he actually hit a little bit of those check marks in my research today, but he's strictly a tournament play for me today. But the fact is that he's close to Carlos Frias in price. I probably won't be using him too much, but I did want to mention him. The Angels scored just 2 runs against Kyle Kendrick yesterday. I know we target a lot of Angels bats, a lot of people did, but Kendrick somehow managed to shut him down. And of course, when you think about the Angels, think about Albert Pujols, Mike Trout, Cole Calhoun at the top of that order. Besides Trout, none of those other guys are really hitting much, and that's something to target when you're looking at these pitchers facing the Angels because you think about them, you think about Trout, you're like, oh, I'm going to stay away. But the results have been there. I mean, even Kyle Kendrick pitched well against them yesterday. So if you want to spend on a guy that will be a little bit, or save rather, on a guy that will be very low owned but could have upside, like he was kind of like a Chris Heston yesterday, very cheap. Nobody was really on him, but you kind of wanted to use him because of that strikeout rate. That's kind of what Lyles is like today because of that matchup against the Angels. Benny talked about the guy he's staying away from, and that's Francisco Liriano, and I do agree with him because the Phillies changed their lineup entirely against left-handed bats because they use guys like Darren Ruff, Jeff Francoeur, who's still playing in the league, believe it or not. They usually have 6 to 7 guys that are definitely right-handed with a few switch hitters in there, and that changes everything. Now, if Ryan Howard and Chase Utley are in the lineup today, Liriano might be a little bit of an attractive option because of all those lefties, but you have to keep an eye on that matchup because head coach or manager Ryan Sandberg likes to take out those lefties against left-handed pitchers, and I think that's why the Phillies are hitting 274. But that brings me to the next guy I'm staying away from today. It's another lefty, and Jose Quintana. A lot of people will have him show up on their research today because the Brewers struggle a lot against left-handed pitching. But we talked about it yesterday. That was before they had Ryan Braun in the lineup with protection. That was before Carlos Gomez came back. They have some good right-handed bats in that lineup, especially with Segura hitting well at the top of the order now. You have to get through 4 good right-handed hitters. And Quintana's not a very good pitcher, although he will pop up in your research with the Brewers righties or how they struggle against left-handed pitching. Quintana has a 5 ERA. He gives up a lot of hits. He walks some batters, and he rarely gets out of the 5th inning. So be sure to stay away from him, even though if he pops up on any of your boxes in your research. That about does it for pitching today. I'll be back in the chat if you guys have any more questions. But, Benny, you want to add anything to that?
No, I was just going to say, when I start getting into my hitters today, you're going to see that I agree completely with staying away from Quintana. I mean, there's 3 or 4 guys in that Milwaukee order that I wouldn't mind having in my lineups tonight. So that's basically the way I see it. I agree with Josh. You know, like we said, Liriano and Quintana are 2 guys who are going to be popping up on a lot of your research. They're both kind of high strikeout guys most of the time, and they're both guys that, you know, might be better in other spots. But today is just not a day we're going to be using either one of them. But as Josh said, that basically wraps up our pitching for today. We're going to go move on. Before we get into talking about our hitters, we're going to have a segment that we wanted to do today where we kind of mentioned some of the guys who are sleepers. We have about a month worth of data so far that we can look over right now, and there are a couple guys who we have noticed that keep popping up on some of the top rosters, and every time they do, they seem to be lower owned, you know, less than 10% owned, if not more. And those are some of the guys that we want to be targeting, definitely when we're playing in our tournaments and even in our head-to-head games, our cash games. You know, these are guys who can differentiate your roster. Now, when I say guys that are low-owned, I want to make a distinction here. The guys that we're going to mention on this list are guys that we still think are solid plays on basically a daily basis. Almost every day, some of these guys deserve to be in your lineup when the matchup is good for them. We're not talking about taking a flyer on a guy who, you know, bats 7th or 8th in the lineup and only plays 1 out of every 4 days. You know, these are guys who play every day. These are guys whose names you're going to recognize, and these are guys who you're going to say, oh, yeah, I know who that is. But for some reason, they never make their way into your lineup. So let me get into it right now. I'm going to, tell you about a couple of our sleepers, and as I start moving down the list, you're going to understand what I'm saying. These are all guys who are solid quality plays. You can probably even think of the matchup that you want to play them in off the top of your head right now, but for some reason they almost never make their way into your lineup. So at catcher, a couple of the sleepers that we've been looking at lately, Wilson Ramos, who's the catcher for the Washington Nationals. He's been absolutely on fire. Has about a 13-14 game hitting streak going. This guy is about as consistent as can be. He winds up getting you, he doesn't have the huge upside, so he's not a guy whose name you hear mentioned. A lot of the stuff that you read, a lot of the shows that you watch are geared kind of more towards the GPP crowd, towards the people who are playing in the large tournaments. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but you're going to have guys like Stephen Vogt who tend to be overowned because everybody's writing them up, everybody's talking about them, so everybody knows the names. The good players know these guys. They're one of the few people at their position who bats in a quality spot in the order. But those aren't always the guys that help you win, because basically a guy like that is going to be 25, 35% owned depending on the slate, depending on his matchup. So even if you do have him, so does everybody else. But a guy like a Wilson Ramos or the other catcher who I wanted to talk about, Russ Martin, these are guys who have been putting up good numbers and have been doing it at low ownership. In Ramos's case, it's basically because he's kind of overlooked, batting a little bit further down in that Nationals order. He doesn't play in a good hitter's park, so when they're at home, he's probably not as good a play. But when they go on the road and they go to some of these good hitters' parks, Ramos has been putting up some good points. The second guy, Russ Martin is a little bit of a different problem. People are starting to realize that this guy's producing, but people don't want to pay up for him. Tonight on DraftKings and FanDuel, he's either the most expensive or the second most expensive catcher on the board. And remember, it's going to be that way a lot because as long as they're adjusting for the parks that these guys are playing in, anytime Russ Martin is playing at home in Toronto, his price is going to be up there. And because his price is pretty high, people seem to just gloss right over him. But again, he's been a guy who's been putting up double-digit fantasy points and helping people win. We've seen him on, more than one top roster in the last couple of weeks in the Moonshot, which is the largest field tournament that DraftKings offers. So if you can see a guy who's making it to the top of the largest field tournament, if you're playing in some of the smaller fields or if you're playing over on FanDuel, this is a guy that you want to have in your lineup. So Wilson Ramos and Russ Martin are two of the sleepers at catcher that you guys should be keeping an eye on because they're guys that are helping people win GPPs. If you move on to first base, one of the first basemen who is flying really far under the radar, and almost nobody ever plays this guy, he was on the winning roster last night in the Slugfest as well, is Eric Hosmer. If you don't know, this guy is just getting better and better. He's probably my favorite hitter to watch on the Royals right now. The other day, basically I heard it mentioned, people were saying he's a five-tool player. He can hit for average, he can hit for power. He's got sneaky speed for a big guy. I think he's like 6'4", like 220, but I mean he can run for a guy that size. Not even just for a guy that size. I mean he can run, period. He can steal some bases for you. He can stretch a long single into a double. He can go first to third. A lot of the things that you look at, that kind of go under the radar, Hosmer does them, and he winds up racking up runs in a lot of ways. I mean, he gets a lot of hits. He scores a lot of runs. He knocks in some RBIs. He has a little bit of power. Like I said, he can steal a base every now and then. So he's a guy that for some reason is never more than 5% owned at a very stocked first base position. I think his price is a little bit up there for most people. But again, if you look at his production versus on his price, he's right up there with anybody else that you want to put up there at that first base position. So when you can get him away from home, because Kaufman's not really the greatest home run hitter's park, but if you can get him in a matchup against a right-handed pitcher somewhere away from home in a better hitter's park, he's definitely a sneaky guy who should be in your rosters. In the last 8 games, he's gone over 24 DraftKings points 3 times. So if you get a guy who can give you 24 DraftKings points, that's going to be about 4 to 6 times his salary, and that's the kind of guys that you need if you want to win some of these big tournaments. That would put you on pace for 200, 218 DraftKings points like people had last night, and can help you take down one of these large fields. The other guy at first base is Chris Davis. Chris Davis with the C, the one that plays for the Baltimore Orioles. Davis has power. That's basically what he has. He's a left-handed bat who can hit home runs. In 3 of his last 8 games, he's gotten at least 16 DraftKings points. So he's another one of those guys. On DraftKings, he's actually first and third base eligible. On FanDuel, he's only used at first base, so you got to use him over there. But if you can put this guy, and again, he's another one who's a little bit pricey, so he's not easy to fit in. But if you can get guys like this into your lineup, you're going to have a guy who's basically contrarian without really having to take a punt or throw a dart, as we say, and hoping that you get lucky. A guy at second base like Alex Guerrero for the Dodgers fits into this category as well. A guy I really like at third base, who we're going to talk about today a little bit more, is Todd Frazier. He's got 6 of his last 10 games where he's got at least 12 DraftKings points. And again, he's another guy that keeps going 8% owned, 7% owned, 5% owned in some of these large fields. He's not a household name, so people tend to look over him. He's expensive. But again, the guy just keeps producing. And as long as he's producing, he's the guy that we need to look at and put into some of our lineups. There's a couple outfielders as well I just wanted to mention real fast. Mookie Betts from Boston has been putting up some good numbers lately. Matt Holliday from St. Louis has been on fire. He has at least 9 DraftKings points in 6 of his last 7 games. So just like we love Carpenter because he can get you 10 points a game, well, his teammate Holliday is doing basically the same thing. So when you're looking for a guy who's a little bit cheap that you can put it in the outfield spot and be pretty consistent and pretty sure of, Matt Holliday is definitely that guy. And the last guy I wanted to mention is Michael Brantley of the Cleveland Indians. Had a little bit of a slow start to the season, but he has double-digit DraftKings points in 9 of his last 10 games. And the one game where he doesn't have double-digit DraftKings points, he still managed to put up a 7. So if you've been playing this guy the last 2 weeks in your cash games, he's been basically doing exactly what you need him to do and giving you the kind of return that you need from him. So while everybody else is paying up for, the Matt Kemps and all these other guys who are in bad hitters' parks, bad matchups, bad splits advantages, a guy like Brantley just keeps chugging along with double-digit DraftKings points. So that's our teaching point for today. We want you guys to realize that when you go contrarian, you don't have to go and pick somebody who's so off the board that you're the only person in the world who has them. All these guys here are guys who've been averaging 12 to 25 DraftKings points, guys who have had games where they've scored over 20 recently, and they're all guys who make perfect sense. They're batting in good parts of the order. They're, going up and having, multiple hit games, hitting home runs, but they're not the guys who are the sexy pick for the day. They're not the guys that everybody was talking about. They're not the guys that pop out to you. Like we said, if you look at first base with a guy like Hosmer, there's 6 or 7 other sexy plays that people take every day. The Adrian Gonzalez's, the Joey Vottos, the Jose Abreu's. Well, Hosmer's been out producing almost all of them except for maybe Adrian Gonzalez, who has just absolutely been on fire to start the season. But if you put Hosmer's numbers up against all those other guys, he's better. And, that's why we're saying these are some of the ways that you can go contrarian without, reaching and really hurting your lineup. Giving yourself the same kind of upside that you would need to win, but doing it in a way where you don't have the same guys that everybody else does. So that's our teaching point for today. But basically now we're going to get into our hitters for today, which is really what you guys want to hear about. Who should I be playing today? Who should I be trying to put into my lineup? So let's start at catcher for you. The first guy I'm going to mention is Buster Posey. Now, Posey has been underperforming and basically been a little bit of a disappointment so far this year. I completely understand that. But he's got a really good situation going today. He goes up against a left-handed pitcher in Brett Oberholzer, who's basically one of the worst pitchers in the league. He's allowed right-handed bats to hit 290 against him over the course of the last couple years. And if you played any DFS last year when he was down in Houston, he was a guy, who we basically wanted to target against as often as we can. So Posey's getting to go up against him. Posey absolutely smashes left-handed pitching, and he actually hits better away from home where, basically he plays in a really good pitcher's park. So if he's going to be on the road today in a place that yields a lot of home runs, is a good hitter's park, and he's getting a great matchup with his preferred splits against a guy who's not very good. So if you're looking to spend up at catcher today, I definitely think Buster Posey's a guy that you want to look at. I think he's got a lot of upside. I think he can get on base a couple times today. And again, this guy's a former MVP. So if he comes out and has a 3-for-3 game with a home run, a double, a single, a walk, a couple runs scored, a couple RBIs, it wouldn't shock me in the least today against Oberholzer. So he's one of the guys I think you should definitely have on your radar. The other catcher today, if you're playing over on FanDuel, this is basically a FanDuel-specific play, is Victor Martinez. Martinez gets to go up against Ricky Nolasco. Now, again, if you played any DFS at all last year, you know that anytime you see Ricky Nolasco's name, he's a guy that you target against. And he makes it real easy on you because you don't have to do any research when you're targeting against Ricky Nolasco, because he gives up a 290 batting average to right-handed batters. He gives up a 290 batting average to left-handed batters. He's an equal opportunity home run allower. Gives up about a dozen to each side of the plate every year, almost like clockwork. So if you're looking for another catching option and you're over on FanDuel, I definitely think you want to try to spend up at catcher today. I don't like some of the cheap options, and I don't like a lot of the guys today that people have been using a lot lately. The Monteros, the Grandiles, even Stephen Vogt. They don't really have good splits matchups, or they're not in good ballparks. Basically, all of them have a couple warts on them. So for me, if I'm going and looking at catcher today, I'm going to be spending up. On DraftKings, I've been looking at Posey a lot, putting him in a bunch of my lineups. And over on FanDuel, I used a little bit of Posey and a little bit of Victor Martinez so far. So those are the two guys I think you definitely want to have, some kind of exposure to tonight, because the upside that they have, especially over on FanDuel, because they have the kind of upside that not many other catchers have, and they're hitting in a good spot in the order. So I definitely think you want to have some exposure to them. Moving on to first base, there's actually three guys I'm going to mention today. The first guy is somebody who we just mentioned in that sleeper pick section, and that's Chris Davis. Davis goes up against Aaron Sanchez. Sanchez has already pitched in Baltimore once this year, gave up 2 home runs, didn't even get out of the third inning in his first start. He pitched against Baltimore again up in Toronto, gave up another home run that game. So basically, in less than 9 innings pitched total this year against Baltimore, Sanchez has given up 3 home runs. Now, one thing that Sanchez, he's very young, so he doesn't have a lot of data that you can go on. But so far in his young career, we've seen him struggle a little bit against those left-handed bats. He's a right-handed pitcher. And, a guy like Chris Davis hits better at home when he's in Baltimore. So that's a plus for him today. He also hits better against right-handed pitching. So, again, that's a plus for him today. And with Sanchez having a high home run rate and, Chris Davis being a home run hitter, all the pieces kind of fit together for Davis to have a pretty good game today. I expect him to be hitting in the 4 spot today with guys like Paredes and Jones in front of him. Probably have, a couple bats like maybe Delman Young hitting behind him today. So he definitely should have a chance to drive in some runs. He should have a chance to, get a couple hits. And he's one of the guys who, if I had a home... So Chris Davis is definitely somebody I think you could put in there. Again, because of his price, because he's a little pricey, he doesn't always make it into a lot of lineups, so he tends to go lower owned. So if you're playing in tournaments, this is the guy that has he's a tournament play. He's a guy that has that kind of upside where he could hit you 2 home runs or get a couple hits and a home run in a game for you, and just as easily he can go 0 for 4 with 4 strikeouts. So for cash, I think he's a little risky, but, again, the matchup's good today. Everything, all the boxes kind of check off for him. The other 2 first basemen I like today are both in the same game. You got Miguel Cabrera going up against Ricky Nolasco. I won't go into all the Nolasco stats that we talked about already with Victor Martinez, but like I said, he gives up equal opportunity home run allower from both sides of the plate. Guy who basically gives up bad batting averages to right-handed and left-handed batters. So I'm not going to shy away from using anybody from either side of the plate today against Ricky Nolasco. As a matter of fact, if you use anybody at all in your Detroit lineups today, you have my seal of approval, because I expect them to really get to Nolasco and put up a bunch of runs. And I think the Twins are expecting Nolasco to throw 4 or 5 innings for him no matter what. So even if he's getting shelled, I think they're going to leave him out there and, just kind of let the bombs keep dropping on him until he gets there, so they don't burn out their bullpen. So I definitely like the Detroit bats, Miggy being one of the biggest ones. Again, we all know that he's not the Miggy of 2 years ago. Injuries seem to be, nagging injuries seem to be dragging him down. He's not the guy who's probably going to win the Triple Crown this year, but again, the guy's got plenty of talent. He's a very good player, and he's in a really, really good matchup today. The other guy on the other side who I also like is Kenny Vargas. Vargas is going up against Kyle Lobstein. Lobstein's a left-handed pitcher. Vargas is the right-handed batter in that platoon over there at Minnesota. And if you take a look at his game logs on FanDuel, he's basically been returning between 3.5 and 4.5 points in all of his recent starts. And some of those haven't even been against left-handed pitching, which is his preferred split to begin with. So he's a guy who's pretty cheap. I know over on FanDuel he's only like $2,700. So he's definitely a cheap first base option that you can put in there who has some kind of upside. I don't know if he has the home run upside to be the great GPP play for you over on FanDuel, but if you're looking for a nice cash game play on either FanDuel or DraftKings, I definitely think Kenny Vargas is somebody who's in line for a pretty good game again today. So those are my ideas on first base. Again, every night there are so many first basemen that you could use. There are anywhere between 6 to 10 guys who should have a good game or should have a decent game. You know, first base is probably one of the positions where you have the most guys that bat between the 3 and 4 spots in the order. So there's always a bunch of ways you can go with it. Look for the good matchups. Look for the guys in the good parks. And again, I don't recommend punting first base. It's definitely something you should pay up for. So don't be afraid to make first base one of the positions where you look for a home run and you look for power. Moving on to second base, there's a couple interesting options at second base. And again, it depends what site you play on. So I'll mention some of the sites as I go through some of the players. For starters, one guy I like on both sites today is Brandon Phillips. Phillips is batting almost .390 this year against left-handed pitching. He's been moved back up in the order. He's hitting the 2nd spot. He's hitting the 4th spot. He's hitting the 5th spot. But he's basically in the top 5 every week now in that order. So that's definitely a good thing for him. And he gets a matchup today against Eric Stults from Atlanta. And Stults is a left-handed pitcher. Last year, or actually, let's go back to 2013. In 2013, he gave up a .301 batting average to right-handed batters with 13 home runs. Last year, the batting average dropped a little down to .279, but he allowed 20 home runs. So far this year, in only 23 innings of work, .293 batting average with 6 home runs allowed to right-handed batters. So the way you want to attack Eric Stults is definitely with the righties. And, there's basically 2 of them on Cincinnati that we're going to talk about, and one of them is Brandon Phillips. Again, I gave you Phillips' stats. He's hitting .390 against left-handed pitching so far this year. So you got a guy who struggles to get righties out and a guy who does really well against left-handed pitching. So you put those 2 things together in a good hitter's park like Cincinnati, I definitely think Brandon Phillips has a lot of upside today, especially at his price. He's a little bit cheap all around the industry. He's not dirt cheap, but he's going to be a discount over some of the guys who you've been using, most of the time, and some of the guys that a lot of other people are going to be on today. The second guy, and this is if you're playing at FanDuel, because he's second baseman at FanDuel. On DraftKings, he's listed as a third baseman and an outfielder. But I know Jimmy Paredes' week is over, but again, this guy just keeps producing. He still keeps hitting. He's got prime lineup real estate, batting in the 2-hole. Has guys like Andrew Jones and Chris Davis batting behind him. Manny Machado's been moved up to the 1 spot, so he's got a guy in front of him who's been hitting the ball right now as well. So Paredes is definitely somebody you got to keep an eye on. On DraftKings, he's getting a little expensive, but he's still cheap on FanDuel. So if you're looking for a second baseman on FanDuel, I definitely have no problem with anybody putting Paredes in there. I think he's got a pretty decent matchup today. He goes up against Aaron Sanchez. Sanchez has basically been struggling against those left-handed bats. Paredes has actually been hitting better against right-handed pitching anyway. So I think this is a really, really good matchup for him. Definitely something that you might want to have a piece of. The last guy at second base I want to mention is Brian Dozier. He's in that same game that we discussed, that Detroit-Minnesota game with the highest line on the day. Goes up against Kyle Lobstein. Lobstein's a left-handed pitcher. Been struggling a little bit so far with righties in a very limited sample size. I mean, he hasn't been in the league very long, so we don't have a ton to go on here. But if you don't think that Dozier's a good play, just take a look at his price on all the sites. He's jacked up to almost $5,000 on DraftKings today, and he's $3,500 on FanDuel, which makes him, I think, the 3rd highest second baseman. So both of the sites, which have been doing a lot more adjusting for matchup and park this year, both have him rated up towards the top there. And again, he's a guy that not a ton of people play. I feel like he tends to go lower owned. I'm going to be honest with you. I have a tough time paying up $5,000 for him. If I'm going to pay $5,000 for somebody, I'm going to look at some of the $5,000 outfielders, maybe some of the $5,000 first basemen, even a guy who we're about to talk about next, like Todd Frazier, a $5,000 third baseman. I can't get myself to spend $5,000 on a second baseman unless it's Robbie Cano playing back in Yankee Stadium against a right-hander who gives up a lot of home runs. And even then, $5,000 seems like a lot to spend for second base. So, those are a couple of the guys who we like. Like I said, Dozier, if you have the money to spend up, the matchup's good. He's definitely somebody who has upside today, but he's also kind of expensive. I'd be looking more towards Brandon Phillips. He's probably my favorite play. And, over on FanDuel, I wouldn't mind slipping in a little bit of Jimmy Paredes. Moving on to third base, there are 2 guys that I'm basically going to mention. Now, you also have a couple other guys like Miggy, Chris Davis, and Paredes who are all third base eligible over here on DraftKings. So if you want to get one of the other first basemen we mentioned and move one of these guys to third, I think you can do that as well. But there is a third baseman I love today, and that's Todd Frazier. Again, we went over Stoltz's numbers: 301, 13 home runs in 2013, 279, 20 home runs in 2014, 293, 6 home runs already this year. So he's definitely somebody who struggles with right-handed bats. And Frazier's been hot lately. You know, we mentioned 6 of his last 10 games. He's got 12 DraftKings points, and he's got a perfect matchup today. He's a right-handed batter going up a left-handed pitcher. He's hitting at home in Cincy, which is a park that's a good hitter's ballpark. He's got the power to hit the ball out of that place. He can hit a couple, get a couple hits for you, drive in a couple runs. He's going to be on base so he can score a couple runs. So he's got a lot of upside. He's got a lot of ways that he can score today. Definitely like Todd Frazier. Definitely think he's somebody who should be in your cash game lineups, and I even think he has GPP upside today as well. If you need to save a little bit off it, Manny Machado is another guy who's been red hot. They moved him up to number 1 in that order for Baltimore. Gets the same matchup we talked about against Aaron Sanchez, who hasn't been all that great this year. And Machado's got double-digit DraftKings points in 5 of his last 8 games. Basically, he's got the home run power, so he could even get you a home run today off a guy like Sanchez, who's been giving him up. Playing at Baltimore, good hitter's ballpark. So there's a lot in his favor as well, and he's a lot cheaper than Frazier is. So if you're looking to save money, Manny Machado is probably the guy who I would come down to on that. And definitely if you're thinking about rolling out a Baltimore Orioles stack today, which I don't think is a bad idea if you're playing in some of these tournaments. Moving on to shortstop. Shortstop is a really tough position today. As you guys heard at the beginning, I gave my little rant about Tulowitzki not looking right. I don't like any of the expensive options. The other guy a lot of people are using is Hanley Ramirez, who, as you guys all know, I love. I've recommended him a lot before he got hurt. But even him, he's not playing at 100%. He's got something physically wrong. Tulo's got something mentally wrong. I just don't like any of the expensive options today. The one guy who makes some sense to me, though, is Jean Segura. Segura is leading off for that Milwaukee team. He's basically starting to get a little pricey on DraftKings at $3,900. On FanDuel, he's only $2,600, though, so I think he's definitely in play there. He's going to be a guy that I'm using a lot over there. He gets a lefty in Quintana who gives up a lot of walks and hits, a lot of runs, and, basically he hits very well against left-handed pitching over his career. So far this year, he's actually hit phenomenally well against left-handed pitching. He has a .423 batting average so far this year against lefties, so it's one of the higher ones in the league, basically up there in, Jose Altuve territory. And again, he's the leadoff batter. He can get on base. He can steal a base for you. He can score some runs. He does have a little bit of pop as well. So Segura is the guy I'm going to be rolling out there a lot at shortstop today. Now, outfield is kind of tough. There's a lot of options, but I'm just going to mention some of the teams that I'm going to be targeting. I really like those Milwaukee outfielders against Quintana. Guys like Ryan Braun, Carlos Gomez. Both of them are normally a lot better against left-handed pitching than they've shown so far this year. So I think they'll have some progression in their numbers coming soon, and I think that coming soon could be today against a guy like Quintana, who's one of the weaker lefties they've seen so far this year. I also really like the Detroit outfielders today. Mostly the guys with some power, because I think Nolesko is vulnerable to giving up home runs from time to time. So I would look at a guy like Yoenis Cespedes or maybe a guy like J.D. Martinez. Those are a couple of the guys that I think you should definitely try to include some of those big bats. As we said with Nolasco, he's equal opportunity home run allower, equal opportunity hits allower, gives up like a .290 batting average to lefties and righties, gives up about a dozen home runs each year to guys from either side of the plate. So I'm not afraid. I don't mind the fact that it's a righty-righty split with a lot of these guys. And besides, a lot of those Detroit Tigers bats hit pretty well. Despite being right-handed, a lot of them hit right-handed pitching pretty well too. So those are a couple of the guys. You get the highest over-under game. You get exposure to guys like Cespedes and J.D. Martinez. So I think there's a lot of upside with those guys as well. So that's basically how I see it so far today, with all the hitters. Right now, Josh and I are going to give you a little bit about our cornerstone, some of the guys that we really like today. Josh, you want to start the people off and give them, some of the guys you're going to be using and building around?
Yeah, first of all, in 50-50s and head-to-heads, especially on DraftKings, I'm going to have Cole Hamels and Matt Harvey. I know they're expensive. I know you're going to have to find some cheap bats. But I think those are the two guys that have the safest value today. You're not risking too much with a good matchup. So I'm going to have both of them as my options on DraftKings. For pitcher on FanDuel, it's going to be basically right now a coin toss for me on Harvey and Hamels. But the way that coin falls is going to be based on those lineups. If there's if there's a bunch of backups for either opposition for Harvey or Hamels, I'm probably going to target him more on FanDuel, but I'm going to have both of them pretty much everywhere. In my tournaments, I'm probably going to have a little bit more Carlos Frias. I'm going to have guys like Yordano Ventura. If that game plays, I'm going to save a little bit on pitching in the tournament so I can spend up on those big bats. But as for hitters, I'm going to need a lot of cheap guys. I know the one hitter I plan on spending up on today, and you mentioned him before, is Todd Frazier. I think he's the probably the play of the day. He's been hot. He's hit, I think he had 11 home runs now. I think you said earlier. Just he's one of the better bats in the slate today. And if I can pay up for a hitter, if I can afford it with the cheap guys, he's definitely the one hitter I'm targeting. What are you doing today for your lineups, Benny?
Well, I got Harvey everywhere. If I'm playing on a one-pitcher site, there's a good chance that Harvey is my starting pitcher. If I'm on a two-pitcher site, there's a good chance that he's one of the two pitchers that I have in there. And again, we all know he's expensive today, so he's not easy to fit into lineups. So you can tell already that I'm going to be going a little bit cheaper in other positions because I'm using him. I do love a guy like Segura, I said, definitely on FanDuel. He's one of the ways that I've been saving some salary with him down at only 26. I agree with Josh completely. I think Frazier has the best matchup of anybody on the day today. I've been pairing him with Brandon Phillips, who I feel is a little bit undervalued in a lot of my lineups on the different sites today. So I'm definitely going a little bit heavy on that Cincinnati game, but I have no problem with that going against Stoltz. I don't think he's a very good pitcher, so that works out well today. I'm targeting a lot of the Detroit bats. The problem I have is a lot of them are expensive, so it's been a little bit tough to fit them in there. But I definitely think that Detroit is in for a big day today, going up against Kyle Gibson. I also don't hate the guys who I've been noticing that are a little bit cheap that I've been putting in there are the guys on Minnesota today. Minnesota going up against Kyle Lobstein for Detroit. I don't think Lobstein's a very good pitcher, so that's basically how I've been getting some of my cheaper bats over there. I really like the matchup for Milwaukee against Quintana. He's another guy I've been targeting today. Basically, I have a lot of guys who I'm targeting today. 3 or 4 guys, so it kind of feels a little bit more like a GPP night to me. I'm going to be shying away a little bit from the cash games today because I feel like Harvey is going to just be so highly owned that it's going to come down to bats. You probably won't see me with many cash games at all on FanDuel tonight. I just think you're basically playing hitters versus hitters because I think everybody's going to be putting Harvey in that top spot. So I'll have some cash games over on DraftKings. I'm going to be playing in some tournaments, but mostly the tournaments on FanDuel. DraftKings, I'll probably have a little bit more of cash game action, which is a teaching point for you guys. Remember, look at the slate on a given night. If there's only one pitcher that you really like, well, to me that says it's a FanDuel night. Or it says if I'm going to play on DraftKings, a 2-pitcher site, and there's only one guy I really like, that I'm going to be taking some chances with that second starting pitcher. So that makes it basically a tournament night over on DraftKings if you're going to be taking chances with a starting pitcher too. When you have 2 guys that you really like, well, that makes it a DraftKings and Aces cash game kind of night because you could put both those guys in there like last night with Simon and A.J. Burnett and kind of ride around them. So allow your research to dictate where you play and how you play. That's what I try to do. There are some nights where, I really like a lot of chalk guys, and if that's the case, then I'm playing in a lot of cash games. If there's nights like this where I feel, 1 or 2 or 3 of those spots where some of those bats I mentioned are going to go off and have a big day, it's probably a day where I'm going to play a little bit more into tournaments and, kind of go stack heavy on some of them. So that's kind of the way I'm feeling about it tonight. So we'll see how it works out, and hopefully I'm right.
Yeah, that's basically going to be the game plan, I think, tonight, Benny. I agree with you. It's either Harvey and low-price bats or Carlos Frias and high-price bats. I feel like that's the only 2 ways people are going to go on FanDuel in these head-to-heads and 50-50. So keep that in mind when you're playing over on the one-pitcher sites. But as for DraftKings, there's more ways you can go, but I still think that Harvey and Hamels will probably be the 2 most highly owned. But that pretty much brings us to the – oh, yes, I'm Nad?
Oh, no, I was just saying I agree with you over there. I mean, it's, on FanDuel, you're going to see a lot of Harvey. So if you don't mind taking your bats against somebody else's bats tonight, that's probably going to be the deciding factor. DraftKings, you always get a little more diversity with the 2 pitchers. So that's why I said I'll probably be playing more cash games on the DraftKings side today.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure. I definitely think that with those 2 pitchers, it's going to come down to hitters. So be sure to keep an eye on those cheap lineups or those cheap guys in lineups when they release. You can find that on the RotoCurve lineups page. definitely a good tool to use. Has weather, has lineups, has where they're hitting. It's definitely something that I use towards the end of the night when making my lineups. But that basically brings us to the end of the show. We will not be back tomorrow, but we will see you guys on Friday, May 15th at noon Eastern time. You can find Benny and myself on Twitter at Josh Kalachi and at BennyR11. You can find us on the chat and the forums. We'll try to be around as much as we can to answer any questions you have. Be sure to take advantage of those forums because you're getting curve points every time, and that's just a nice way to learn things, to talk with other guys in the community, and it just gives a good way to get free stuff if you can accrue those curve points. So that brings us to the end of the show, and for me, that's for Benny Ricciardi. I'm Josh Kalachi. This has been The Curve. I know Benny has one more thing left to say, which I'm going to have to get some T-shirts made or something, Benny.
That's right. Stay classy, DFS. Have a good day, guys. We love you, and go make some money.